Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome to the Political Insider. I'm Brett Smith. Joining me today is Kelly Vlahos. Kelly is the editorial director at Responsible Statecraft and a senior advisor at the Quincy Institute. Prior to that, she served for 3 years as executive editor of the American Conservative magazine, where she'd been reporting and publishing articles on national security, civil liberties, foreign policy, veterans, and Washington politics since 2007. Kelly's also the host of the podcast Crashing the War Party, which is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and at crashingthewarparty.substack.com. Kelly, great to talk to you today.
Oh, great to be here. Thank you, Brett.
Give us your thoughts on Biden's State of the Union last night.
Well, I mean, the first thought I had, and I got the transcript a few minutes before the speech started, so I immediately try to scroll down to see the issues that are important to me, which are foreign policy, and quickly realized that the foreign policy element to this speech was a minuscule portion of the speech. It was actually within like the 700 word range if you include what he said about Ukraine and China, out of 7,500 words total in terms of the speech itself and the transcript form. So I was pretty disappointed at the short shrift that he gave to a war in which we've allocated over $113 billion of American taxpayer money over the course of the year and invested a lot of intellectual energy, a lot of emotional commitment to fighting this protracted war in Ukraine, a proxy war, mind you. We do not have U.S. soldiers fighting directly in Ukraine, but we've done everything up to that line. Yeah. And for him to spend 206 words, I think it was, on Ukraine, and those words being sort of a word salad of sentiments that he has already sort of broadcast in previous speeches, things like autocracies are on the back foot, America stands for freedom, we stand with our friends, we've stitched together this wonderful alliance in NATO and other countries against, the autocratic scourge in Europe. And, that's pretty much the whole of it right there. And I found that quite disappointing, considering the complicated dynamics right now of the war in Ukraine. As for China, he didn't mention the balloon incident directly, though he did reference, a threat to our sovereignty and how that's not a very good bet, Xi Jinping. But we will continue to cooperate with China where we can, and we will protect our interests otherwise. And that's about it. That was the whole of it. And so I just found it very thin and concerning, because I feel like even throughout the 20 years of war, during the global war on terror, presidents usually do downplay foreign policy in their speeches. And I don't like that, because I feel like this is the area in which Americans should have more skin in the game, more investment, should know what the country is doing in their name. And to downplay it basically sends a signal to the American people that, nothing to see here. We got this all handled. You don't really need to be paying attention to this. But like I said, we're talking $113 billion have been allocated for this war. Yeah. And we are invested to the point where it's escalating every day. It could turn into a direct conflict with Russia. It could turn into a nuclear conflict with Russia. But yet it's given such short shrift in this, annual State of the Union address.
Yeah, you're right. It's a lot of money for just some platitudes, basically, because that's kind of what I got. We're now past the 1-year anniversary of the start of the conflict in Ukraine, and it seems that neither Republicans or Democrats, except for a slim minority in either party, seems to be drawing back on the amount of weapons and money that we're pouring in over there. What do you think it's going to take for this Cold War to turn into a hot war?
I think many of the people who are much smarter than me talking about this have really warned about the push for more advanced weapons in Ukraine. And right now, Volodymyr Zelensky is overseas, his hat in hand, trying to pressure European governments. This week it's UK. to give him fighter jets. And if you talk to anybody who knows anything, they'll tell you that that will escalate the war if we do give F-16s, for example, to Ukraine. This will push Russia perhaps to the point where they may start using tactical nuclear weapons. And I know that analysts on my side of the fence, people who have been calling for restraint all along, have warned about this from the beginning. And it seems as though the Biden administration has had a series of red lines about how deep and how far they'll go in terms of advanced weaponry and assistance to Ukraine. And they've crossed one after the other after the other. What they haven't crossed yet is no-fly zone and the F-16s. But as you know, just 2 weeks ago, they approved the transfer of our M1 Abrams tanks. And so I feel like, I don't know if there's just one trigger, but I know that the F-16s are a big part. If we start assisting, and I know we probably have been very closely assisting targeting, if we start putting troops inside, I mean, there are a number of things that could set this off. But I think allowing Zelensky to take this to the next level, and I'll be honest with you, it's very cynical, because the United States has said time and again, including last night in the State of the Union, that we will do whatever it takes to assist Ukraine in its war for as long as it takes. And we've signaled that we are dug in for the long haul, and that Ukraine should be dug in for the long haul. But yet we're not going to give them the tools to actually have a fair fight. And I don't want there to be an escalation. But I feel like this thing could go grinding on, will end up destroying Ukraine, because they have limited resources, much more limited than Russia. But at the same time, we're kind of pushing them to keep going, keep going, keep going. And that puts me, I feel very nervous, sad about that, because I know Ukraine has lost many, many more soldiers and possibly civilians than we even know about, because of the distortion field in the media. And I'm afraid at one point we're going to wake up and realize that that country is destroyed, and that we had to help in doing that. And that in typical American fashion, we'll probably just walk away and pay, and shift over to the next front, which would be China.
Yeah.
Just like we did with Afghanistan. And I'm just afraid that we're heading in that direction.
Yeah, I hear you. First, it was the Patriot missile batteries, then the Abrams tanks, and this F-16 is a real red flag to me as well. I feel the same way you do. What do you think the most likely scenario for Ukraine is? Do you see the Ukrainian government willing to concede certain parts of the country to Russia, or do you think this whole thing ends when every Russian soldier is either dead or repelled?
I don't think the latter is going to happen. And again, there's much smarter people than I talking about this. No one seems to honestly and realistically believe that Ukraine can push Russia completely out of the country, particularly out of Crimea and any of the territory it was holding in the Donbass before the February 22 invasion. And so I think that's off the table. I think there has to be some move towards a ceasefire and then a negotiated settlement. I can't tell you if the Ukrainians are ready for that, if they're willing to make any concessions, if the Russians are ready for that, whether they're ready to make any concessions. I do know from talking to other analysts in this world that both countries, both leaders, Putin and Zelensky, are very much pressured from their right flanks. So there are people in their governments and their political orbits that don't want to give up, that are highly nationalistic, and would see any concessions as an absolute defeat. And so they're under pressure to keep it going. But I do believe that's the only way to end this thing, is to bring both sides to the table, whether and get to some negotiation, whether that's over, Ukrainian neutrality, whether it's um, Russia giving up the territories it gained after February 22, but staying in the Donbass, in which the majority of people who live there are Russian speaking. There are things on both sides. We could talk about lifting some of the sanctions to get those talks to move them along. I mean, so there are a number of things that people have talked about in terms of how this can happen, but it's difficult to see how we get there with both sides pretty much dug in. And to be honest with you, I can't really get a clear read on where the Biden administration wants to go on this. They seem to be all over the place. Sometimes you hear gentle signals that they want the Ukrainians to start thinking about moving into a diplomatic direction, and then you see articles in like the New York Times saying that people inside the administration think that Ukraine could recapture Crimea. So I don't know. It sounds like there's an internal battle going on, or that just might be what they want us to think. I don't know.
Moving on from Ukraine, all eyes appear to be on China now because of the spy balloon. What does it say that the same country trying to help Ukraine defend its border can't even take down a weather balloon with a couple cameras over U.S. airspace?
Yeah, I mean, you're raising a real issue that everybody's talking about here in Washington, is how does the Biden administration feel it can keep its eyes on two potential war fronts at the same time? And you'll talk to members of the administration and their supporters, and they say, of course we can. We can walk, and they always say we can walk and chew gum at the same time.
Right.
But if you look at everything that we've done in terms of the assistance and the marshaling of forces, the training, the political energy that we've put into Ukraine, it's a hell of a lot. And we're already seeing stories about stocks being depleted. We have U.S. military and NATO going to different countries across the world and begging them to give up their stockpiles to Ukraine, whether it be in South America or South Korea. We've been pressuring them. It's hard for me to think that we can just shift it over, like turning a ship, to China and still keep an eye on everything that we've set into motion in Ukraine. I realize there are two different situations. I realize that we aren't technically on the ground in Ukraine, but like I said, we've been doing everything up to that point. We're training soldiers in Germany. We're sending a lot of military hardware over there. We're spending a lot of money. And so we're keeping an eye on everything. We're leading a whole coalition. And then if you turn to China, that everybody I talk to say that it is a different kettle of fish, in that they are a lot better prepared for war than Russia ever was. And they would be a much bigger threat. And all of the wargaming that's been done here in Washington, setting up scenarios between the US and China over Taiwan, we lose big time. And you can just Google it up. War games, China, Taiwan, US. I think the last one was done at the Center for Strategic International Studies. I think I got that right, CSIS. But yeah, either we lose outright, or we just, everybody loses. I mean, just tons of ships sunk, people killed. And so, and these games have been going on for the last few years, and they've had equally dark conclusions. And so I just feel like there are a lot of people in Washington who are living in a la la land, and they love to talk about war, and they love to talk about building up for war. They love to stick their chest out and call people like me defeatocrats or whatever defeatists. But when it comes down to it, I don't think that they're living they're in reality. I don't think anybody really knows what it would be like to get into a hot war with China, much less at this particular moment.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are under the assumption we're the United States of 20 years ago or 30 years ago when it comes to the military, and that's just not the case right now. And yeah, hot war with China, it's terrifying. That's scarier to me than when I was a kid in the 80s with the USSR and under the threat of
Yeah.
mutually assured destruction. Um, yeah, China's a whole different deal than the Soviet Union. So, and I think a lot of people compare the two, and I don't think that's correct. Very
Yeah,
different animal.
they compared it to, but also they don't know, they have no sense, any real sense of what it's like to live through a war.
Mm,
And they think that they believe in the whole mythology of the US as a superpower and having this great military that can throw its weight around and bully the rest of the world. And I just don't, I think that because we have never had, aside from the Civil War, a real, um, a visceral war impact on this country, on our territory,
mm,
that it has always been us fussing around other parts of the world and coming home with clean hands, that we can talk about confronting China in this way.
mm.
And and have this sort of distortion field of what we believe that would look like. And I'm afraid, and it's just like with Ukraine, where we talk about upping the ante and escalating it and giving them all of these weapons, and not taking into account the actual nuclear threat
Hmm.
involved in that, because so many people either forget what it was like to live through the 80s, when you did
Yeah,
wake up every morning and wonder if there was going to be a nuclear war, or the boomers who had to live through the Cuban Missile Crisis
yeah.
and the duck and cover
Duck and
drills.
cover, right?
Yeah, so most people just either forget, or they
Yeah.
didn't live through that. So they don't
It's
feel that visceral fear of nuclear annihilation.
it's been a long time, since those days, even though it doesn't really feel like that for me. Um, but I have to remind myself I'm middle aged now, but I don't feel that way. But I just think that it's a reference point that you either have or you don't have.
Yeah,
Boomers, Gen Xers probably have it. Some older millennials maybe who saw the in '92 the wall fall. But for a
yeah.
lot of people, a lot of younger people, I think that it's just not something that is even relatable. Anyway, sadly, we're out of time. Kelly, go ahead and give everyone your social media coordinates as well as where they can find you and your work.
Sure. I'm on Twitter at Kelly B. Vlahos. That's Kelley B. Vlahos, Vlahos. And I am writing and editing at responsiblestatecraft.org.
We'll link to all that stuff as well in the comments below. Thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Love to do it again.
Thank you, Brett. Me too.